So the bell has tolled, so it means that it's probably my time to start. This talk is about a site that I worked on called beta.telus.com. And my name is Chen. I'm from Canada, Nashville. So thanks again to the DevWeek organizers for having me here today. This is actually my second DevWeek talk. So was anyone at my AngularJS talk yesterday? Okay, good. So I didn't actually scare anyone away because I went over my time, but people stuck it out, so I'm kind of amazed at. So I just wanted to preface this that it's not a very technical talk. It's actually going to be more of a process talk. So if you're here to look at code, there will be 2 lines of code, and that's about it. So there's not a lot of code, but I think it's a talk that's very relevant to developers and how we work with each other. And so I call myself a technologist and an educator because I actually have a fairly winding career. I've done quite a few things over my time. And so I actually work quite a lot right now with hardware, meaning like Arduinos or websites and web apps, and especially mobile optimized websites. So I run my own company called Karma Laboratory. I actually do a lot of Arduino workshops through Karma Laboratory, and I also do some technical workshops like Angular workshops or just web development workshops. I worked with a company in Canada called the Canadian Film Centre. They had this very sort of neat lab there called the Media Lab, where students would come in for 5 months and do this sort of boot camp, interactive entertainment sort of program. And so I was a research and technology manager there, which means that students would come in, and for the last 2 months, they were asked to make a prototype. So they formed groups, and then I was their technical lead for when they came up with really wacky ideas. So 1 year, a group of students came and said, I want to make origami shapes from text messages. And I was like, okay, so I'm doing that for you. So I would just kind of figure out whatever needed to get done in order to execute on their kind of wacky ideas. I volunteer with an organization called Ladies Learning Code. There's chapters all across Canada, and it teaches women basic technology skills and hopefully to get more women into technology. I'm going to talk all about Telus. This whole presentation is about Telus, so I won't get into too much about Telus there. And currently my day job is that I'm a technical writer at Google, so I work mostly with Chrome-related technologies, so I do a lot of stuff with tutorials and documentation for Chrome apps, HTML5 rocks, or Yeoman. And so this talk is called Responsive, Iterative, and Collaborative because it's a bit of a case study of what I did during my time at Google to not just reboot their website, but also to help reboot their corporate culture. It was actually a really amazing experience for me, and so I'm really happy to be here to sort of share what I learned and what the organization learned over about a year. So some Telus quick facts. So I know Canada is across the ocean, but who here has heard of Telus? A few people. Okay, great. So Telus is one of Canada's largest telcos. There's 13.3 million customers. We offer sort of like 3G and 4G wireless connectivity across the nation. Certain regions have home internet and optic TV. And you most likely know them from their careers. So if you didn't know the name Telus, you probably have recognized ad campaigns with all these like pandas and frogs and stuff like that. So by Canadian standards, Telus is quite big. It employs 40,000 people across the country. The main bigger offices are in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. So I'm actually based out of Toronto, that's where I live. So I worked out of the Toronto office. But my teammates were in Vancouver or in Montreal. And so one of the big things about big companies is that they become very enterprise-like. So who here would say that they work at an enterprise type of company? A few people. So keep your hand up if you enjoy working in an enterprise company. A few people, that's good. So who here would sort of identify more that they work at more of a startup type of environment? A few people. And keep your hand up if you enjoy working in a startup environment. So I think, like for me personally, like I work with startups, I've worked in a startup, I've worked with startups. So I love working with startups because they're so small and they're nimble and they get a lot of shit done. And I really like this feeling of accomplishment of getting stuff done. And I don't necessarily feel that in enterprise organizations because there's a lot of bureaucracy. So I wouldn't necessarily, if Telus were to come to me 2 years ago and say, hey, I want to come work with us, I'd be like, no thanks, I don't think I would do that. But I had a really amazing opportunity that I'm going to talk about. So this was the old Telus. It was a desktop website, had some like really bad accessibility questions around like green text on white. It had a lot of stuff on the home page, it was really cluttered. And kind of the ironic thing is that for a telco, a company that sells mobile devices, their website did not work well on a mobile device. So if you looked at telus.com on your iPhone, it looked exactly the same except for shrunken down. So it wasn't that they didn't realize that, but because their website was stuck sort of in this enterprise type of content management system, it was really, really hard for them to make even small adjustments to make it a bit more mobile friendly. Updates, even from a technical standpoint, took a few hours to even get published. But not even just technically getting something published, it might take 3 to 6 months for one department to ask for a request and actually have it show up on the website. So 3 to 6 months for something to even show up. So there was a lot of red tape in Telus. And I don't have any pictures of this, but if you can imagine an enterprise type of building, it was very much like a cubicle farm. So you would go to one floor, it looked exactly the same as another floor. And you can tell that someone was a manager because their cubicle walls are just a bit taller than someone else's. And if they're very senior, their cubicle walls might go to the ceiling. So it was very like status-based. And it seems kind of very typical as an organization. But in 2012, there was a sort of a new vice president of consumer who joined the Telus. And he's been in the telco industry for a while. His name is Sean Mandel. So he's been there for, like in the industry for a while, but he just started at Telus and said, you know what, I'm not gonna have this, I'm gonna shake up this place. So he really just went and like gutted a lot of Telus in terms of like how he was gonna move Telus to the future. So for Sean, this wasn't like a website redesign, it was actually a culture reboot. So it was actually a project that was really interesting because it wasn't just about building a website, it was about building a team. So by the end of 2012, Telus teamed up with 2 vendors. There were some other vendors, but these were the 2 main ones. Heist, which offered a lot of design and strategy, and Nascent, which I actually represented. And Nascent sort of offered more of the technology and a bit of the UX design. And so between Heist and Nascent and some internal Telus employees, we sort of formed and created the Telus Digital Labs. So internally it was kind of cool because the VP had pulled together, sort of hand-selected a bunch of internal Telus employees to sort of represent the Digital Labs. So people who were sort of more forward-thinking and were really hoping for organizational change. And then for Heist and Nascent to come in, we were the people from the outside saying, you know, this is kind of how the real world works, and this is how Telus should work too in order to be a more sustainable corporate culture. So we worked side by side. A lot of times people wouldn't know who was from what company, and that was fine because even though I technically worked for Nascent, I always just tell people I worked at Telus because it didn't matter. Like Telus was my project, and these were the people that I was most accountable to. So here's just like a little shot of the craziness was in our lab. So the first project at our lab was to just reboot Telus.com. And it was to make it in a very fully responsive, mobile-first approach. So our approach is very different to what Telus was used to. But for one thing, we launched the website, or at least soft launched the website in 3 months. So 3 months for an enterprise company of that size is like more or less unheard of. So it was really interesting because that was just 3 months for not even just like to build a website, but actually to do customer research, to do concepting, wireframing, graphic design, and development. We did that all in 3 months. And since it was like the first 3 months, we launched something to the website at least once a week. And so globally, Telus was one of the first responsive telcos to go responsive. I've seen a few where they might change their homepage, but then you click through and the rest of the page is still desktop optimized, or it hasn't changed. So it was kind of cool that Telus was willing to jump ahead and go responsive. And another really important thing about how we launched this was that we didn't just come up with plans and execute it and then just put it out there. We actually soft launched it under beta.telus.com. So telus.com existed in parallel, it was still running. And then we would sort of try to redirect people to beta.telus.com to get them to give us feedback early and often. So we were building the website in public. So we were hoping that people would come and tell us what they liked and what they didn't like. So it wasn't us kind of assuming what the customer wanted. We wanted to hear from them. So that was a really unique approach, is that we built it in public. And so I've kind of given this a form of this talk before as a lightning talk. And I had someone come up to me after and say, you know, I'm really confused. You actually are a developer, you kind of speak like a manager. So for some of us, that might be like, I'll take it as a compliment. So to clarify that I actually was like the lead front-end developer for this project. But over time, what had happened was that our team grew. So the lab started with myself and another internal developer. I was the lead, and our team grew and it grew and it grew. And it grew so big to the point where it's like, you know, someone had to kind of step away from production and actually be more of a mentor, because we were getting a lot of employees internally and externally who just needed a bit more training. So instead of staying like a developer, I actually changed my position to become a developer advocate, meaning that internally I work more as a mentor-oriented in-house training. So I am very technical, but I do speak like a manager. So. And so I will talk about some of the frameworks that we use, but I think the key thing when working with other people, especially when you're making software or making websites, is that I think dealing with people are actually like way more complex than working with technology. I think like working with technology sometimes seems like really simple, but whenever I felt like a project was slowing down or timelines were getting behind, or there was friction, it was always because of communication problems. Not because technology wasn't working for us. It was always communication problems. So it's a three-part: responsive, iterative, and collaborative. I'll just talk about responsive first. So why would you want to go responsive? Is there anyone here who is working on a responsive website or has previously worked on one? So a few. So is everyone here more maybe an application developer? So I think the really nice thing about going responsive from a website standpoint is that you can share your customer experience across different platforms, meaning that when a customer kind of goes and does stuff on their laptop and then they pick up their phone to do like a quick read, they don't have to relearn a new interface. They can kind of carry over things they learned from the desktop and carry it over to the phone and vice versa. And Telus had a really grand vision actually for using the web as their platform to build out a lot of their applications, because not only were we going to relaunch the consumer side website, which is more of a content website, we were also going to relaunch a lot of our internal self-serve, or where you go and log into like a My Account section. Like we were going to rebuild that out, also web, also responsive. And then we were going to share all of these resources across different platforms or departments, meaning that Telus.com might be for a consumer-facing customer, but we can actually give the same website to a customer service rep or an in-store vendor and actually have them use the same interface. So everything would be driven by the web. So we wouldn't be going and spending, or Telus wouldn't be going and spending millions of dollars building a special tool just for the customer service reps or another special tool just for the in-store vendors. Like we could just use like the web and use that one platform in order to target multiple audience members. So in the end, that would save Telus billions of dollars. And so we took an approach for Telus, the beta site, as a very mobile-first approach. And so for me, like mobile-first means like a few things. Obviously, when you kind of think about mobile-first, you think of targeting phones, but it's a bit bigger than that. I think it means that when you think mobile-first, you think of that everyone's going to have changing usage context over time. So right now, like when I look at the Telus traffic, web traffic analytics, I see people, from iPhones, from Android phones, Blackberries. I see tablets, and I even see like people on their PlayStations. I don't know what they're doing on the couch, the Telus site on their PlayStation, but there's a huge number of traffic coming from PlayStations. That's not a small number. So it's just kind of weird. So you just kind of have to know that people are going to change their context, but mobile first means that you focus and you focus and you focus. So it means that you get rid of all that sort of fat content, where if one department's asking to put on the home page a link to download to a PDF calendar, you're like, no, that does not deserve to be on the home page. Does it even deserve to be on the site? So it's sort of a matter of being able to cut out all the extra fat and really thinking about what the user wants, because we have to kind of think that the customer's time and the real estate on the page is very valuable. It's extremely valuable, that we have to make choices and hard decisions about what we should be putting in front of people. And so the really interesting thing for the site was that our measurement of success was to make sure that people weren't calling in and asking the call centers questions. If they weren't calling into the call centers, we would actually save billions of dollars. So it was a really lifesaver, or sorry, it was a money saver. So interestingly enough, unlike a newspaper or some sort of content website, the less time a customer actually spends on the Telus website actually means that the project is more successful. So unlike a website, like a newspaper, where you want someone to stick around and click through links and like stay there forever and click on ads, like we don't make money off ads. So the most successful thing is that someone can get to the site, find what they want within seconds, and then leave. So that's actually a sign of success. So at the heart of responsive design is the very simple media query. If you're not familiar with CSS, it sort of just looks like this, where you have an @ sign, you have media, and then you kind of say what features you want to target. You can target multiple sort of properties. And so this might look like this for an iPhone. So you might say @media. For anything that has a maximum width of 320, so this is kind of what an iPhone typically would be at, is 320 pixels. Serve up images at 100%. And so media queries at its heart are quite simple. If you were targeting an iPad, you could say between the width of 321 and the maximum width of 768, serve up this type of image size. And so we can chain on a bunch of these, but for Telus, we kept it fairly simple. We had 3 breakpoints. We had something that was iPhone-ish, something that was iPad-ish, and something that was desktop-ish. And I'm not going to get into technical details, but the only important gotcha that will catch you is you got to update your page's viewport. So in your sort of website's head, if you do not add this width, device width, then when someone gets to your website, the page actually just jumping down. But when you say width, device width, or width equals device width, that means that the size, the viewport of your browser will sort of resize to be optimal for the device that you're looking at it on. So that's really the only gotcha. So if you start getting into media queries and you're like, my media query is not working, it's probably because you did not set this viewport. And if you were interested in getting into, not necessarily too technical, but responsive web design, it was a really great book that I read a few years back. And it's from A Book Apart. They're the same company that runs A List Apart, which is a really great resource for web designers. And there's another book too called Mobile First by Luke Robosi, and he's the one who kind of coined the term. And both of these books are awesome because they're really, really short. So you can get these books done in an afternoon, and you can kind of feel accomplished that you learned so much about both responsive web design and mobile first design. So I definitely highly recommend these books. And so the most popular and probably easiest way to get started if you're interested in getting into responsive web design is to use a framework. Anyone here have you used Twitter Bootstrap before? So a few people. So this one is the most popular one where at one point, whenever you went to a startup's webpage, it kind of looked all the same because they were all using Twitter Bootstrap. Because essentially what Twitter Bootstrap is that it's two parts, it's like, or maybe three parts. One is a grid system. Another is UI components, so like buttons, drop-downs. And then the third is a few JavaScript components that sort of work with your CSS components. So it's a really great way to sort of, bootstrap your application using these sort of reusable components. One that I kind of, at that point, a couple years ago, Bootstrap has changed a little bit. But we used to use from a company called Zerb. They have a CSS framework also called Foundation. And it's sort of the same thing as Bootstrap, where it's a grid system and it's also a bunch of CSS UI components. So it's a really easy way to get your site responsive very quickly. But in the end, what we ended up using was something from Oddbird called Susie, and it's a grid system. And all it is a grid system. And that's all we really wanted. So it's really nice that instead of sort of getting everything packaged up with Bootstrap or with Foundation, we said we just want the grid. And so we have this really, really light framework just to do grids for us. And it actually is not that hard to make your own grid system. It's just requires like a little bit of math. But I liked the idea of using a framework, especially when you're working with a team, because there's external documentation. So if you've ever worked on an internal project and there was a really poor documentation, and then you try to onboard people onto your project, you might realize that it's a bit of a hassle. So the more that we can kind of offset to other people to maintain, the better for us, because we were a growing team. And so this might look like this. So this is Susie, and in the background you can see that we didn't actually launch the site with the grid, but this is the debug view for the grid. So I think I can actually show you this in browser. So you're not going to see the desktop breakpoint because the monitor is super small. But this is the tablet breakpoint. And you can kind of see that the background is simply sort of laying out where our grid would be. And the designer would come through and we would sort of have a common language of what our grid system would be. So we would always know that, in a tablet view, a panel like this is going to take up 2 columns. So it wasn't, so you didn't have to have any guesswork around, having specific measurements, and you didn't say that something was X number of pixels. You would say, this is going to be 1 column, 2 columns, 3 columns, 4 columns. This is how much padding it is in columns. So that way, when someone does go and resize this, you can see that it sticks to the grid. And then at one point, the breakpoint's going to happen. And then you kind of know that, when you're in more of a phone format size, that it's going to be, everything's going to be more in the 4-column grid. So using a grid is, I would say, essential when you're doing a responsive website, because it gives you and the designer a common language to work with. Whenever I would have one of my developers come up to me and complain about working with a designer, it was always because they were unwilling to stick to the grid. So as long as you guys can just stick to the grid, life is just so much easier. So I thought using Susie and a grid system was definitely key to quickly being able to build out a responsive website.
Is Susie responsive out of the box, or did you have the responsive behavior into the Susie CSS grid?
Susie can be fixed or it can be responsive. So there's options. So I don't know if I still have the code on this laptop. But what I did was I kind of set up a configuration file for all the things that we wanted Susie to do. And I don't know if there's a CSS only version of Susie, but we use something called SAS, which is a CSS precompiler. So it helps us maintain larger projects. Let me see if I can actually find my configuration file. So this is in SAS. So like we would just import the Susie library, which is sort of, it's a Ruby library. So Compass is based on Ruby, and so Susie is also based on Ruby. And then you sort of configure things. So you can turn on the debugging grid. And then you start setting up breakpoints for like what you want to target. And then there's a few other things like, so if you wanted a responsive website, you would choose fluid as your container type, and then I think they had fixed. I can't remember all the options. And Susie has also been upgraded very recently, so it went from version 1 point something to 2. So this could actually be slightly different now. But I thought it was like, I just had to set up this one file with the 3 breakpoints, give it to my developers, and then they could just go. So it's really nice having a grid system like this.
How far back does it support? Because IE6 was what we used out of the box.
Okay, good question. So I'll come back to the IE question. And, but I will have a teaser that IE8 does not support media queries. Okay, where did my slide go? Okay, so that's great. So most of the designers I work with, they traditionally worked in Photoshop, so they love using Photoshop. So for one of the designers, like he found this tool called Guide.me, which is a Photoshop plugin. And so then I would get these wacky like Photoshop files from him with like these crazy grid systems. So I'll actually show you one of our files, if it fits on the screen, or if I can even find it. I don't know where it went. Where'd it go? Can we open it? Kind of zoomed off screen. The screen resolution is all wacky. You can plug it into a projector. All right, that's fine. Maybe I can just zoom into this. So you can kind of see that guide.me will just slot in all these grids here. And he preferred to work in a file where he had the phone, tablet, and desktop. And you can see as long as he adheres to the grid, it's really easy to translate that into code. And so, sort of this balance when you're doing responsive web design is between, the visual design and the code complexity. So I have a story where, a few stories, and as I kind of mentioned, whenever one of my developers complained about designers because they weren't sticking to the grid system. So at that point, like in order to reduce the complexity of the visual design, is to actually push back to the visual designer and say, we need to stick to this grid system because we're trying to launch this really quickly. So you have to cave a bit with your design. So it might be an amazing design, but in the end, it might not actually be worth it for something to be pixel perfect. Because in the end, the customer is going to move they're going to be on different devices. They're going to see a different view. So for a designer to think so pixel perfect, it's actually not worth a developer's time to do that. So as much as you can come up with a common language of, say, using a grid system, the better. And then I had another story where another one of my developers came up to me because she was working on this one page, and we have 3 breakpoints. We've always had 3 breakpoints. And when a phone breakpoint gets close to a tablet breakpoint, things do look a bit kind of like too wide on our website. But it's sort of this sort of no man's land where only a few devices actually have that sort of resolution. So we kind of say, okay, well, it doesn't look amazing, but we can live with it. But then the designer was kind of like fiddling around with things like, I want to add another breakpoint right here just for this one thing. And then she was trying to figure out how to do that. And she came up to me and said, how can I implement this? And I said, the best way to implement this is to not implement it, because not only are you going to spend extra time implementing this feature, but another developer who's used to our 3-grid system or 3 breakpoint system is going to look at this file and think, what the hell is going on with this like one thing here? So then there's a bit of a training that needs to be done and extra documentation. And then QA is going to look at the rest of the site, QA the site, and totally forget to check this one feature, this one page where there's an additional breakpoint. So in a lot of ways, like when you want to reduce the code, you have to work with your designers to come up with the best solution in order to not to get into like huge technical debt, because these little things of adding little exceptions here and there add up to all these extra things of having to put in extra documentation and training people. And when you developers come on board, like you don't want to spend that time telling them these little details that they need to know. Like you should have an overarching framework, and that should be enough to carry like designers and developers into efficiently developing a website. So those are my tips for responsive. I'm going to talk about iterative. So anyone in here took art school in high school or anywhere? No? Okay, so who thinks they're good at drawing faces? I'm like, I used to actually be good at drawing faces, but there's actually a technique to drawing a portrait. And this is sort of the recommended way where you kind of shape out someone's head first, like to get the proportions right. And then you start adding features like the eyes and eyebrows. And then you start adding in the rest of the face, and you're kind of roughing stuff out. And then you can add more additional features. And then you add the contouring and shading. And eventually you end up with like the final product. And so I think this is actually really related a lot to doing websites and software design, because everyone's so fixated on this final end product that you don't really think about all the stages that you should go through before you kind of make the final product. And so a lot of steps kind of get glossed over, especially when you're doing your timelines where like you have this sort of finished mock-up and everyone thinks that that's going to be like the final result and that nothing could possibly go wrong with this build cycle. So a lot of details really get glossed over, but I think the most important thing that we were doing with the beta project was to be very iterative. Because if you think about the details too early, they'll slow you down. So if you were doing a portrait and you fixated too much on getting that eye perfect, you might realize that proportionally the nose got wrong because you had to spend so much time in the eye that you couldn't place the nose correctly, or that the head of the shape was a bit weird because you had to compensate for how much time you spent on the eye. So it's best not to fixate on these details too early because they'll slow you down. And it's really important just to get the base overall structure right, because everything else will be much easier if you can just get the base right. So we got our grid right pretty early on, and it made doing everything else afterwards a lot easier. I also worked on a UI component library, which made life so much easier for the developers and for the designers because we had a common language to work on. And so that was what getting the base correct. And then you want to set goals and learn from each step. But if you go over things really quickly, it's good because if you get it wrong, or you find out that you're not solving the right problem, you're not so invested in it, so then it's easier to throw it away. And it's actually really important to realize that you should throw things away when they're not working. And so if you spend 2 months on something, you're going to feel hard-pressed to like want to throw it away. But if you only spend an hour, a day, even a week on something, it's okay to throw it away. And so the ways that we sort of iterate is that we do some paper prototyping. We have sketch sessions where actually everyone is involved. So we not only are the designers in the group sketching, but developers invited to join, copywriters invited to join. Like everyone who has a vested interest in the feature that we're working on should join. And we have like these sort of like 2-hour-long sketch sessions where that's when we mock up stuff, and you don't have to be a great drawer or anything, like you're drawing boxes and like scribbled lines. And then we can kind of go into another phase where if the developers are super busy, designers can actually use other tools like PowerPoint, Keynote. We use something called InVision, which lets you take sort of like mock-ups and put like hotspots on them, and then actually put it on a phone. So we could take these sort of clickable presentations or prototypes into stores and actually ask people like, what do they think? Like, and because we're putting it on your phone and it's sort of clickable, we can get feedback right away if something's working or not. We don't have to wait until the very end where we have a finished product in order to put it in front of someone. Like, we should find the lowest, least frictionless way to get it in front of someone, because customers have like weird ideas about, or actually no, so it's not the customer, it's us. We have weird assumptions about what we think people want, but when you put it in front of someone or multiple people, you kind of realize that you have these assumptions. And when you sort of test your assumptions, you can figure out if you are actually solving the right problem or not. And so I started a process at Telus. It sounds easy, but it's actually hard to get yourself not to go down these rabbit holes. But I sort of split it up into 3 stages, where we had a low fidelity stage, a high fidelity stage, and then what I would call a production ready stage. And so what this meant was that instead of jumping right into waiting for a designer to give you a Photoshop mock-up that's like pixel perfect, I could actually start working with the UX developers who they could be just wireframing, and I can actually start, mocking out the website using their wireframes. And it's really important at this stage to not get sucked into details. So you can see that in these early prototypes, like we were just using like square buttons and boxes to mark out images, and it was really good because when you're doing responsive web design, the breakpoints kind of have a story to tell, but all the details in between the breakpoints also need to get figured out too. So when you have this sort of lo-fi prototype, it's a really quick way to figure out if things are flowing correctly. So sometimes designers ask for like a box like this to suddenly show up here when you're in a smaller breakpoint. And so you can prototype that and figure out, is it really worth the time to actually do all the work to move content around, or is it better just to keep the flow? And so having a really lo-fi prototype like this really helps you nail down the flow. And so sort of the goals of this sort of low fidelity round is to structurally put your content in blocks so you can figure out if things are flowing correctly. You can do any proof of concepts of interactive elements. So these could be drop-downs, navigation system, carousels, and it's a very low commitment way to figure out if a UI element is the right one to be using. Because if you've ever used a drop-down menu, actually this is kind of related to what a goal of this was, that I was working on, we were trying to figure out what the best navigation system to use. And so the UX developer sort of mocked up this 2-level drill-down, drop-down system for mobile. But I realized that once I got it into this lo-fi prototype that it took up too much screen real estate, and then the page would kind of jump around when you were clicking through and drilling through. So this is not something you can discover with a static mockup. It's something that you have to discover by actually using it, or having previous experience having done like a 2-tier navigation system. So this is what the lo-fi stage is really good for, is doing these proof of concepts of interactive elements. And the most important thing is that you need to time cap yourself in this sketching period. Like, you shouldn't spend too long in it. So give yourself only half a day or a full day to execute on something, or at least break it down into a smaller component. That way you can actually deal with it in a half a day or a full day, because you could throw it out. And so the reason why you want to do this lo-fi stage is that, getting started is kind of hard. Sometimes we procrastinate, or we think that we know what is going to happen in the end. But if you just get started, you're going to have a better idea of what's going to happen in the future. Developers get developers get involved with the design process earlier. I hate getting mock-ups just handed to me and someone saying, here, just make this look like this, or to even feel like that developers are at the end of the line and not part of the ideation process. So if you get yourself into doing these lo-fis, you get to be involved with design a lot earlier. You get better time estimates because you're actually building something and it's not theoretical anymore, it's actually becoming real. And then you can actually, for some user testers who are used to sort of understanding what a wireframe is, they can actually go and click around on it and give you feedback, and you can sort of validate your assumptions. And so then our second stage is what I would call high fidelity prototypes. So this more or less looks exactly like what the mock-up should be. But in this stage, instead of jumping from just a blank slate to a mock-up state, you're iterating on your lo-fi prototypes. So structurally, you have all your stuff in place. Now you can start layering in your visual elements. And because you've already took a crack at it, you can now say, okay, I have a better way of restructuring the CSS and the HTML. So then you can sort of implement these improvements already. But just remember that code optimization is not the point of this round, but you are learning from your previous experience. And at this point too, you can start preparing. If you are a full stack developer, you can start preparing some of your backend services, or you can sort of give your backend developer a heads up that these are the kind of things that are coming down the pipe. So maybe if they have to set up servers or databases, they can start doing that at this phase. And so obviously this is great for having a better designer developer workflow, because you can sort of comment on things in their Photoshop comps if they're not working, or if they are working. You can sort of work with them at this earlier stage without worrying about it being too optimized. So you don't have to wait until it's finished. You can start layering in components as they come in. And then at this point too, you can start identifying if there's frameworks or systems that you need to create or implement or optimize. So one of the things that I did is that the designers, it was great, they had a style guide, and they were building a style guide over time. And so for me, I thought, this is a great way to reduce workflow for everyone, is that if I just take this style guide and convert it into a component library that everyone can use. So this component library became, internally we called it Frogger, because Telus is about critters, so it was like leapfrog, so I created this component library called Frogger, and it made both lo-fi and hi-fi development or prototyping so much quicker for all the other developers, because we had a common language that we could work with. So this was actually something that was really important to optimize early, because it meant that the workload later was going to be a lot easier and lighter. And then we start getting into the production ready. So it's the same as the hi-fi. By this point, the prototype should have been placed in front of customers or user testers multiple times already. So you're not getting to this point where you're spending a long time optimizing code and feeling that you have to throw it away, because at this point, it should be close to being final. Like you have validated assumptions and you know that you're in the right direction. So you're going to wrap up all your dev tasks, do any refactoring, do any pre-QA tests on different devices. So it's always very important that when you're working on anything that's mobile optimized, to look at it on the actual device. So we had a great, because we're a telco, we had a great device lab. So we had iPhones, various Androids, tablets, and so it was really great to be able to test on actual devices. And mobile browsers still have their quirks, especially older web views. So it's really, really important to actually put some of even your lo-fis on there, just to make sure that things don't break apart. And then you can write unit tests and documentation at this point too. And so the reasons why it's great to have this as a sort of final stage is that by this point you've gone through 2 stages of development, like a lo-fi and a hi-fi, and now you're kind of like, you have all these lessons learned from your previous 2 versions, so you can make your 3rd version better. Because our code is never great the first time you write it, it only gets better over time. But it's okay to launch rough code. And I think that's very important. As long as it's not visibly apparent to the customer that you have rough code, I think it's okay to launch rough code. And so the cool thing about beta project and people that I worked with at Heist is that they're very data-driven. Essentially, no one was allowed to come into the project and say, I want that to be blue because I like blue. Blue is my favorite color, so I think you should make that blue. Like, we would never accept something like that. We would always make sure that things were data-driven. So we had a tool on our website actually called ClickTail, and it might sound creepy, but it could actually figure out across your traffic where people were clicking. So there were like heat maps to figure out like where people were moving their mouse, where people were clicking most, how far people have scrolled on the page, and how long someone actually sits like looking at a section on your website. So having actual data back up your design decisions are so important, because it's not because someone from the guide is saying, I like the color blue, everyone should like the color blue. It's more like, maybe people like the color blue, let's put it out for people to look at. And then we can let the numbers decide if that was a good decision or not. And so one of the things that happened with this data-driven decision is that on the homepage, we had this sort of card system. It was a really kind of cool system. It was kind of neat because it was very mobile optimized, where if you were on a desktop view, you would see sort of these promo cards. The first one was expanded. And if you were on a mobile view, you would have it cut off, and then you could use your thumb to scroll through it. And so this is kind of when you have to know when to optimize and when to just ship it. I did a few passes on it, and I really only spent a week on this. I optimized parts of it, so I made sure to use CSS transitions to make it faster instead of just JavaScript. So there's a couple tweaks that I did to it, but in the end, like, I felt like my code was still like it could go through more optimization. And you know, if you are a developer, like, you love spending time on your code and like cleaning it up and like making it like super optimized, but you just have to stop sometimes and just like ship it and see what people think. And so if this was on the home page, after a few months of getting some data on the home page, we realized that no one even scrolled past it. We had like under 10% of the people actually scroll down past the hero banner unit, and these were underneath it. So then it's kind of a point where it's like, okay, we need to figure out what we need to do. Do we keep this, or do we throw it away? Do we move it around? So this is kind of what we use data-driven decisions for, is that, you know, even if I spent a week on this, I was actually okay with throwing it away because I actually didn't spend a month on it. And there were additional optimizations. I had a huge list of things that I could do to this slider to make it better. That would have taken an additional 2 weeks, but no one looked at them, so like, get rid of them. And so that's kind of like, you just say, well, that's fine. Because it's okay to throw things away. We would do a lot of customer research, so every few weeks we would actually have people come in and do, not necessarily focus groups, because it was always a one-on-one, but we would have people come in and we could do exercises with them, like card sorting, they'd give us feedback on our prototypes. So it was a really great way to get a little bit closer to who your potential customers were. Because if we're in technology, we hang around with a lot of technical people who are pretty savvy with their smartphones, but sometimes we would hear people talk in these rooms because we would screen pass it into a bigger room, and we'd be like, how does that person not know to click there? Like, click there. Like, we could like be shouting at them through the screen, being like, please click there. But they're like, oh, I don't know where to click. So it's really good to have that like realization that people aren't you. And a really neat trick that we started doing later in the process was that we would actually take these sessions, and then we would sort of create a war room where we could kind of have a prototype, one version of the prototype. We would go through the first session, get feedback from that session. We would have a bit of a break, so an hour, 2 hours before the next session. And so both designers and developers would then quickly iterate on what we just learned from that session, keeping in mind not to be too reactive to what one person says, but if it's really obvious that an icon is not the right icon, we can actually go and iterate on that within that break. And then next time someone comes in and looks at it, we can actually get feedback on whether or not that changed work. So it's sort of a process of like agile user experience development, and I think that's kind of a really great thing to sort of incorporate if you can. And so, being there, after doing this process a few times, I realized it's really not 3 stages. It's actually 4 stages, in which the 4th stage is actually this giant feedback loop where when we go and launch stuff out, whether it's rough or optimized, we need to schedule into our sort of like overall map scheduling that we need to come back to this feature in 2 weeks, or sorry, not 2 weeks, 2 months, 4 months. But just at some point, we need to schedule in that we will come and revisit this feature. So I think that's really important to have this feedback loop. And so there's some cool new tools that are coming out too. Like, has anyone heard of McCall? Kind of a really neat tool where, if you kind of remember Dreamweaver back in the day, Dreamweaver kind of was saying that it was like this WYSIWYG and everything was going to be awesome because designers could just do their websites in Dreamweaver. And somehow at one point we all said Dreamweaver makes bad code, so we all kind of like went away from it. But now it's kind of having this kind of comeback where tools like McCall, what they do is they actually give designers the ability to sort of mock up something that is, to like mock up their wireframes and their designs in this tool, but then it exports to HTML and CSS. So it's a really good way of getting these lo-fi prototypes out quicker instead of having to have a barrier between the developer and the designer. We can sort of offset more work to the designer. And so it's just coming out of beta right now. So far, the response has been really good, and people are saying that it creates pretty good code. And it also creates, because it's creating CSS, your designs, when you output them, actually are responsive by default. Let's see. I have a few minutes to talk about collaborative. And so, Telus was sort of the first big project that I had worked on with a big team. Like, I've worked with other people, and I would say that most of the time when I've worked on other projects is I was working with peers. But then the interesting thing with the Telus project is that it became such a big team. I worked with people who were slightly senior to me and a lot of people who were more junior than me. So it was a really different experience for me. But having worked with all these kind of different types of people, I started realizing that when we think about programming, we sort of think about programming as being this like Lone Ranger and coding's mysterious, so you should just like, it's a black box and you should just like shuffle stuff to the developer or the programmer and they'll just make magic happen. But what we really should be thinking about is that programming is more like this. It's an intensely social and collaborative process. And so creating software should not only involve developers, but it should involve designers, business strategists, your copywriter, marketers, and it should incorporate them at every stage. And so sort of my first rule is that we created cross-functional teams. So this is actually the Vancouver office, but in the Toronto office, we kind of had it set up in a way where we were literally sitting elbow to elbow in this like tiny little room. Like I think it was about this size, and we crammed like 30 people in there. And so like literally like we were like we had 4 people on a desk, but we were okay with that because like for me to be able to sit so close to my UX designer and the UI designer meant that when I was working on my lo-fi prototypes, I could just like swivel my desk around and say, do you think this slider looks correct? Or does it feel right? And I could just hand them like the phone that I was working on. The designer could come to me and say, hey Pearl, will this work? So it's really good not to go off for a week, like hide away, and then come back and then realize that someone doesn't like your idea. It's much better just to be able to like poke them and say, hey, what do you think about this? And it's going to create a much quicker feedback loop. And my second rule is to always think and type out loud. So we need to stop having private conversations and embrace working in the open. So I hate email. Like I hate people who send me, especially in the company-wide, where people send me an email and then someone a week later says, hey, did you hear about this? Or like, I heard some rumblings about this, and I'm like, yeah, I got an email about that, and we forward you this email. And it's this very like one-to-one sort of like tedious process. And then when email threads get really long, it's it's really hard to find what you're looking for. So I hate email. I wish I could just get rid of email and use something more public. It was sort of debatable. Like some people like Basecamp, other people don't. I love Basecamp, and I would dump all my thoughts into Basecamp. I had a teacher in university who had this tip where when you're working on sort of a new project or any sort of day-to-day work, he would have a developer journal or a programmer journal where he would write down some of his thoughts. So some of the design decisions he made around software, like what commands he typed into terminal. And I thought that was really interesting because a lot of those like little details get lost. And then when you need to onboard someone else, you're not going to remember what command you typed in terminal 3 months ago because it was that one time and you just can't remember. And maybe you screwed up a couple times, so it actually looks like something else. So I actually like use Basecamp for scratch notes. So whenever I start on something new, I just like dump all my thoughts into it, save it. I don't care who reads it or not. And then later on, when a new person joins the team, they're like, "Oh, do you remember how to set up this?" I'll be like, "Yeah, there's a search box. Just type in the word that you're looking for. And you'll probably find the post that I did because I put everything in Basecamp." So it's really great just to have a stream of consciousness and put it up somewhere in the public. It's sort of the same like whenever you're stuck on a problem and you do a Google search and then you come across someone's blog and you're like, "Thank goodness this person wrote this blog." It's sort of the same deal where if you can get the culture internally to start externalizing your thoughts, it's going to be like discovering a wonderful blog like every day. We use, this is an icon for screen flow to sort of represent that. Sometimes when I was doing training, I would actually sit down with someone, but then screencast it or like record the screen, and then we would upload it to a private YouTube account. So that way, like when someone new came along, I was just like, "Well, I don't have the hour to train you today, but can you watch this video?" And they could go and watch this video and then come back to me with questions. So it was a very low friction way of doing documentation. And then we use Skype quite a lot for communication. We tried a few ways of like, figuring out like, the best way to communicate because we had offices in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. And between Toronto and Vancouver, there's a 3-hour difference. So by the time we're at lunch, that's when they're rolling in. By the time they're sort of kicking into their afternoon, we're leaving. So Skype has this wonderful feature where you can make group chats. So I started a group chat. It's been running for like over a year. We have like quite a few group chats for each sort of team. But it's kind of really nice because we can have conversations on this group chat. Even if you're sitting next to that person, sometimes it's nice to just have your headphones on and to be able to instant message someone. But if you're typing in this group chat, Vancouver can kind of come into the video work, catch up on what conversation you had, and then they will be in the loop. So it's none of this sort of barriers of time differences or even different offices. Just having this group Skype chat was like amazing for keeping the flow of conversation open. I can also recommend, there's another software called HipChat that's really great for group chat. Or if your company is like very, very technical, you can always jump into like an IRC channel or something. But regardless of what it is, like stop one-on-one messaging people and use this group chat. I think it was really key. This should be near and dear to everyone that we should automate everything. I hate doing tedious things. For Telus, we landed on Front, which is a JavaScript task runner, and I had to automate everything. And it was wonderful because when you think about working in a team, the more that you can automate, the less disagreements you have. So if your company has a code style guide in terms of like, this is how many indents should you use, like sometimes people, like we get picky over that for some reason, like we're just so like 2 spaces or tabs, like, and we have like fights about it. I don't know why. But if you have something like text editor and plugins, and you come up with a common style guide, you can just reinforce it by every time you save your file, the code style gets applied, and then like no one argues about like looking at a file from someone else and how like the indentations interact. Like let anything that you can automate to let those sort of disagreements go away, better. And I kind of a cool thing that we're running out of time is you should look up this video called "The Secret to Safe Continuous Deployment" by Brett Slatkin. He works at Google, and he sort of came up with this tooling to do visual regression testing, which means that it's really, really hard to test UIs, especially from a CSS standpoint. So what you can actually do using sort of something called visual regression testing suite is that you can take a screenshot of your website at one point in time. When you make changes, you can take screenshots of your web page at that point in time and then compare them. So then if you see differences in the images, you can kind of know that, okay, something moved here. Was it intentional or not? And it's a really great way of doing regression testing and offsetting the work from people manually having to look at websites. So it's a really great 10-minute video. And I think this is my last one, is that the big important thing that when you're working with a team that's very collaborative is that you should have no ego. You should always realize that what you're doing is for the customer. It's not to inflate your skill set level or say that you have the best ideas. Because in the end, even if you think your idea is great, when you put it in front of a customer, it's going to be either a wake-up call or it's going to validate your ideas. So you should always just kind of assume nothing and have your customers tell you what they really want and to listen to them. And so sort of during my time at Telus, I kind of realized that, we make websites, we make code, and customers come and look at it, people come and look at it, but in the end, they don't look at your code, it's your teammates who look at your code. So the real end users of your code are actually your teammates. So anytime you can optimize for knowing that your teammates are your end user, the better. And it's not easy to be collaborative. It's actually really hard. There's days where I feel like, man, this is like an uphill battle. But in the end, we've gotten so much good feedback on the website, and the more that we're critical of each other, the more that we can push each other to be better developers or better designers. So thank you so much for coming. I don't know, I think people are I think there's some sort of mixer in here, but I can take questions until the mixer starts. So thanks so much for coming.